Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Jace Harlow, and our first rule is simple. 3 slow knocks on steel mean stop and stay quiet. No talk at the seam, no extra breath, and no guesses about what stands outside the plate. The door is a steel rectangle set in the hill with a concrete frame and a tight approach. The drop bar locks into a pocket. The hinge pins stay greased, and the slit sits at shoulder height so eyes can read the ground without exposing the face. I keep my palm on the metal for weight and vibration. I watch Coda because his ears flatten before any indicator blinks, and I let the board decide the next step because panels forget nothing and wind can fool nerves. Tessa touches the white noise switch we call rain, so shoe clicks and gear sounds sync under a soft layer. The bend 10 steps in breaks a straight rush without words, and the rubber mats kill squeaks where boots meet concrete. We sweep grit each morning so it will not crunch. We check the bar pocket for chips, and we wipe the slit glass so glare will not bounce a flash outside. Mira runs the periscope and writes time, cloud, and wind on a card taped by the slit. Jonah watches for a red blink from the pressure mat and keeps the battery above half. And I stand at the jam and count to 10 on my fingers where everyone can track pace. Signals stay simple because thinking slows hands. 1 tap stop, 2 move, 3 back. The rope alarm uses the same count, and radios stay dark unless a short word with a name will prevent a mistake. I angle the shield into the dogleg and keep weight on the back foot so the bar takes load if something hits. I breathe through my nose to keep sound down, and I listen for scrape, gravel shift, or a glove on paint. Through the slit, the dirt apron looks clean from the morning rake. Last week's pry mark shows near the handle, and an old scuff sits left of it, but no fresh boot edge or shadow tells me to rush. The panel throws 1 red blink and holds. Coda's ears flatten again, and a small tremor moves through the hinge into my palm, so I nod and Tessa keeps rein steady while Mira tracks seconds. Nothing scratches the paint, the rope alarm hangs straight, the vent tone stays level, and the periscope glass stays clear of fog because nobody crowds the tube. I do not open for noise, for rumor, or for a schedule. The door opens only when the board is dark, the dog is calm, and the approach reads clean through the slit. 3 slow knocks land on the steel with space between them. The echo fades in the hinge pocket, and I keep the bar seated while we hold air and wait for the second signal that tells us if it is safe. The hill has 1 entrance because 1 is easier to guard and harder to fail, and we kept it plain so every part has a job and every check reads the same at night. A concrete frame sits in the rock. A steel plate fits the opening with a narrow reveal, and an oak drop bar spreads force into both jams, so a pry on one side will not twist the hinge. Outside is a short channel between 2 stone shoulders. The floor slopes to a drain, and we rake the apron each morning so fresh marks show. The face has no handle. The only view is a shoulder-height slit on our side, and that slit gives a line on the apron without giving anyone a place to grab. Daily checks run in the same order. Bar seated, hinge pins greased, latch pin free, slit glass wiped, pressure mat clear, rope alarm hung, and the white noise, rain, tested. I run the list at night, Tessa runs it by day. Coda walks the channel before the rake goes away. If he looks back twice, we slow down. We do not open to voices or to the clock. We open to clean signals and to a second proof that matches the first. The slit has rules. No light at night, no shiny metal near the edge, and no muzzle through the gap unless the panel shows red and there is no room to step back. A short shield rests at the dogleg, a pepper gel can lives above the bend, and a lever rifle and a 12-gauge stand within reach in case words fail. Tools live in the same places, and when a spare leaves the hook, a card shows a blank that reminds us to return it. Opening happens in small steps and closes fast if anything feels wrong. We listen first, then check the panel, then clear the approach through the slit, and only then lift the bar an inch to feel weight on the hinge. If the hinge feels heavy, we set the bar back and wait. When the hinge feels clean and Coda stays calm, Tessa calls the count. I lift the bar. Mira tracks time and Jonah holds the shield ready. This morning, the apron line was unbroken, the panel stayed dark, and wind moved left to right. I slid the bar up, set a boot on the threshold to stop a wide swing, and Tessa held the tone steady while I eased the handle. The seal opened a finger and nothing moved. The wedge held the gap while I checked the slit for a shadow or a scrape we missed. Tessa said, "Hold," and I held. Mira said, "Clear." Jonah said, "Ready." A faint clink sounded from the left shoulder where stone meets frame, just metal on rock, and that sound was enough to stop the test. I set the bar back, closed the handle, and checked the slit again. Mira logged the clink. Jonah reset the panel, Tessa lowered the tone a notch, and Coda stared at the seam but did not growl. Nothing crossed the paint line on the apron, the drain stayed clear, and no new chips showed on the bar pocket, so we called it a pass and returned to routine. People ask why not add a second door. More doors add edges to watch and more ways to get trapped. One door gives one focus. If someone forces steel, we fall back through the bend, and if they flood the bend, we blind the corner with gel and push with the shield. We test the sequence twice a day because drills turn panic into motion. We close with the tally board. Water steady, air holds, quiet good. Trust limited to 4 plus Silas when he makes the ridge. Quiet is a resource we guard every hour out here. If someone knocks the first signal and gives us space, we open in stages. If they crowd the frame, we keep steel between and end the talk. The channel stayed empty after the clink. The beam stayed dark, and when the clock hit the mark, we set the bar and waited for the next test. Air keeps us clear and hidden, so we write simple rules and we follow them the same way every time. The vent pulls from a baffled shaft and pushes through filters we can reach from our side. We change the pre-filter when dust turns gray, and we mark dates on tape so checks do not slip. White noise hides shoe clicks, latch sounds, and short breaths. One switch sits by the door and one at the utility wall, and either one can cover a movement in a second. We track carbon dioxide because foggy heads make slow hands. A small meter hangs over the sink, and when it climbs, we open a slow bleed and step the fan one level. Shoes and edges make most noise. Rubber soles get wiped on mats. Squeaky eyelets get tape, and we sweep grit each morning so nothing crunches when someone shifts weight. Soft pads mark routes from bunks to kitchen to door and back to the panel. Tape hugs the inside line, and wedges keep corners from banging. Jonah maintains 2 decoy boxes in the draw. The motors hum low inside foam, and he charges them at midday. Mira reads wind with a ribbon above the approach at dawn. She notes direction against the trees, and it tells us where scent will drift if someone cooks or bleeds. Cooking stays quiet and early. Lids fit, towels under pots, and a small fan pushes steam into a stone pocket. We keep food plain and seal trash cold because sweet rot draws more visitors than light or voice. The shaft has 3 checks, a lever for the backflow flap, a grate with 2 screws, and a screen we clear with a hook, and we clean them on the 1st and 15th. I test fan speeds at shift change. I set an ear to the panel and count hums, and the number goes on the board so anyone can spot drift. Coda sits by the flow when it is right and leaves when something changes, and that tells us as much as any light. We keep voices short near the vent. No stacked questions, one answer at a time, and we do not let stories get loud. Tessa drills breathing with the kids while they stretch, in through the nose and out through the nose. Steady counts, and quiet becomes easier. My timer rides a cloth band so it does not clack. Each alarm means look, listen, and touch, then write the result before memory edits it. Guests use the Decon niche with the rain tone running, clothes in a bin, boots on a rack, hands washed, faces wiped, and we wait a minute before anyone moves past the bend. If someone coughs, we mask for an hour and raise flow, no pride debates because air is shared and rules keep it fair. The rope alarm fits the air rules. 3 pulls means danger and the vent goes high. 2 pulls means move and it stays medium. And if the rope moves without hands, we cut power and listen at the hinge. Jonah said, "Why not run high all day?" And Tessa said, "Noise travels and power runs down." And I added, Strong flow throws scent into the channel while a slow bleed stays inside. Mira wipes the periscope, steps back 2 paces and notes wind shifts or birds that rise. We walk the tape line at dusk with shoes wrapped in cloth. We feel for loose screws and snag points, and we log fresh chips on the jam. I replace tape when the edge frays, I sweep mats when grit shows, and I clear the channel drain after rain. Silas calls with 3 taps and a short check-in. No long stories because his air rules match ours. We practice stillness after a knock, 2 quiet minutes, nobody speaks, and the vent and the dog tell us what to do next. The tally board closes the routine. Water steady, air good with 1 filter moved forward, quiet strong, trust 4 plus Silas, and while I wipe chalk from my hand, the beam on the panel blinks once and holds. Silas came in as a soft hiss and a steady tick that matched my wrist timer, and I left the white noise on because a quiet bed helps words land clean. The radio sits in a lined box with a cloth cover, the cord stays looped so it will not click, and the gain runs low so storms do not flood us. I called check on the minute with our short tag, 3 letters and the hill number with a pause between, and then I waited. Silas answered with his tag and a plain, "You up?" And I kept my words short because short travels better, and I lifted 2 fingers so Tessa knew outside traffic was live. We keep radio talk simple so the kids can run it under stress. Simple verbs, no code books, and any number that matters gets repeated with a space between digits. Mira logs time and the first sentence on a card. Jonah notes wind from the ribbon over the approach, and Coda lies by the door because the white noise keeps him calm. Weather first, then people, then risk. That order keeps facts in front of nerves. Silas said, "Light west wind and broken clouds and a clear band on your side," and I wrote it and thanked him, and then I asked for movement. He said traffic last night on the service road, 2 pickups, no flags, 1 tail light out on the second truck, and they went slow like they hunted for driveways. Tessa said could be the pioneers, and I asked for count and spacing, and he gave 5 or 6 heads with 50 yards between, which fits a probe, not a push. We marked it on the map with grease pencil because pens click, and we set red tape on the frame to remind us to keep the vent on medium until sundown. Silas said, chatter about a water depot near the quarry, and I asked for source, and he said, a woman with a tight sound and a steady key which felt like someone in charge. We do not chase depots without a second source, so I asked him to listen an hour and to note if the voices share numbers or just trade rumors. He said, copy. And then he added a warning. He heard the word hollows twice from a voice down valley, and the tone was tight. Hollows hunt sound and warmth and follow people who get sloppy with gear. They drag home anything shiny or soft, and that habit hurts camps fast. Mira asked, what does tight mean? And I said, the voice did not smile, and she wrote it and kept the scope on the ridge. We trimmed the antenna 2 marks to favor our side because Skip had been messy since the storm, and the handset cleared once the lead lined up. Jonah said, if the trucks scouted driveways, they might tag reflectors, and Tessa said, or toss tins with pebbles, and I said, we sweep the channel at first light and pull anything that rattles. Silas said, I can make the ridge by dusk if I avoid the Quarry road, and I said, only if the ribbon sits north and the panel stays dark, and he said, understood. We never call a friend in unless the door can open because there is no sprint worth a dead end at steel. I gave him our water and air status. He gave his food status, and we left it there because lists tempt people to push closer. He said, one more note. A relay said a caravan with a painted sun moved through their town. Friendly at first, and then hands got greedy, and I said, pioneers often start that way. Tessa wrote the tally, water steady, air good, quiet medium, trust 4 plus Silas, and left a blank in case we added a name before dark. 3 short tones came on the band that did not match our timer, low, low, high, and I said, hold traffic, and we listened. Silas heard it too and sent the tones back. For a voice, none came, only static. We treated the odd triple tone like a knock and reset the door routine because a pattern on the band can mean a scout, and a scout brings footsteps if he thinks nobody is home. Tessa set Rain to medium so small moves would vanish. Mira checked the apron with the periscope. Jonah stood by the panel with the 12-gauge open and a beanbag on top, and my palm rested on steel for weight. The board held dark for a minute. Coda kept still, then the pressure light blinked and held, and that one hold changed posture. Weight shifted back and the shield angled into the dogleg so the bend stayed ours. A pebble ticked the left shoulder where stone meets frame. The slit showed no shadow. The count ran to 10, and the hinge got a second touch to feel if someone leaned. We do not open for ticks because a tossed pebble tests timing, and if timing wobbles, the bar moves, and if the bar moves, the person outside learns how fast we open. One tap meant stop. Tessa nodded. Jonah kept the muzzle low so the slit would not flash. Mira wrote time and wind, and the ribbon above the approach held north. The second tick came at the seam, metal on metal, and Tessa said hold, and the line held, because the seam should not speak unless a tool is on it. We moved slow and kept the rule about sequence because the rule keeps hands steady when nerves want shortcuts. The bar came up an inch. The hinge felt light. The wheel turned a quarter and cold air slipped past the seal without pushback. So the wedge held and the wheel closed. Jonah asked net hook now, and I said yes, and he set the hook above the channel and left the line wrapped. 2 hours later, the panel threw a clean red, not a blink but a hold. Coda's ears flattened, and the hinge carried steady weight like a shoulder set against steel. I said bean bag then gel. Tessa said yes, and Jonah closed the 12-gauge and stood where the slit gave a line without showing the barrel, and the strobe faced the bend. I said step back from the door and say why you are here, and a man answered from left of the seam. He said, we need water and a place to rest. Tessa said ask count and health, and I asked how many and any fever, and the man said 3 and no fever. Then he coughed after no, and the weight on the hinge did not lift. The panel held red. The wheel stayed shut, and rules do not bend for sympathy at steel. I said, step back 5 yards and stand center apron so we can see hands, and the man said, we cannot move a child. And the pressure light flickered and Coda barked once. The flicker meant a foot on the mat, not center apron, so 2 taps moved the shield. The strobe flashed the bend and a body hit the frame low and hard. The bar took the load. The hinge groaned. Tessa said, gel, and the ceiling slit through a cross spray that sent the shape stumbling. Jonah fired the beanbag through the slit. The thump echoed. The pressure light went dark, and I called, back away and leave the channel now. We listened 30 seconds for a second push and kept the wheel shut because a hard rush often comes in pairs. The slit showed a smear at knee height and a wet line near the drain, and we logged both because marks teach later. I dropped the bar, reset the strobe, wiped the slit, and Tessa wrote, attempted rush, non-lethal response, unknown count, 1 low height, cough noted. Mira added, left shoulder needs a steel shoe. Jonah hung a towel over the vent to thicken the rain tone. Coda lay down but kept the seam in view, and the board returned to dark. The tally read, water steady, air good, quiet medium from light bounce, trust 4 plus Silas if the ridge stays clear. Then the pressure light blinked again and held. We reset the timer, checked hinge heat with the back of my hand, and held position while rain covered breath there. The second hold on the panel lasted a minute, then dropped to dark, and we stayed in routine because a steady hand at the door avoids buying trouble with speed. I set the bar, wiped the slit, and watched the apron while Coda held the seam. The rake lines were clean and the drain showed no fresh grit. Tessa lowered rain to medium and checked the Decon niche. Mira slid the periscope to cut glare, and Jonah brought the bin with masks. A woman spoke from the center of the channel. Ruth said, we have a sick boy and we need water. Tessa said, count and signs. Ruth said, 3 of us and the boy is hot and shaking. We open in stages when someone stands center apron and keeps distance. I told her to step to the chalk and leave packs. The beam blinked once and went dark. Coda's ears eased, and I cracked the wheel 1 finger with the bar still seated. No weight pushed back. Tessa said Decon first, and I slid the shield into the bend and lifted the pepper gel. They set packs down. The boy Ben sat on a jacket and an older man, Miles, kept still. I said, masks on for all three and then step to the niche. Ruth said, we only have one. Tessa said, we will pass two on a rod. Jonah taped masks to the pole, the wheel turned a finger, the masks went out and the wheel shut. They put them on and waited. Tessa said, boy first, shirt off, wipe arms and face, no rash, no blood, he asked for water. I said, tell me the last 12 hours. Ruth said, the well went bad, he vomited once. We walked from the creek road and men shouted near the quarry. Miles added, a truck with a painted sun. Tessa wrote pioneers on the card. I stepped the wheel open one hand and slid a bottle into the niche. Ben drank, and Tessa counted to 10 and took it back. We do not let strangers pass the bend on a first meet. The bar must answer for all of us. Tessa said, I want to check his pulse. I said, use the pole and the cuff. The numbers looked like fever, not shock. I asked for names. Ruth said Ruth, Miles, and Ben. She asked for a place to rest, and I knew the answer. Water, food, and direction to cover cost less than an open door and a new set of risks. I said we can feed and give water and mark a safe place under the ledge past the first bend in the creek. Ruth asked for medicine. Tessa said a few tablets and fever drops, and we need them too. She weighed cost and nodded. 2 tablets went out with a note on spacing. Ben swallowed and relaxed. Miles said, I can work for it. I said, not today. Work means noise and eyes at the door. We bagged a half loaf, a jar of beans, 2 bottles, and Jonah marked a ribbon on a map that showed a pocket with cover and a spring. I said, leave before dusk and move slow. Ruth said, thank you. They took the food and then asked to sleep in the channel under our light for one night. We do not let anyone linger at the door. I said no, and pointed them to the creek pocket and the turn that hides it from the road. She said, understood. Ben stood and held the blanket. Miles lifted packs. Tessa said, stand center apron and count to 5. When they did, we opened the wheel and slid the food and bottles across. The wheel shut. They stepped back to the chalk, thanked us once, and walked out without looking behind. We wiped the niche and bagged the cloth. Water out 4, food out 2, medicine 2, no entry. The tally read water down a notch, air unchanged, quiet good, trust 4 plus Silas. I reseated the bar and checked the hinge. The beam on the panel threw red and held. The beam held red for 10 seconds, dropped, then lit again, a pattern that usually means a person testing distance and timing, not an animal. Rain stayed on medium, the shield faced the bend, the pepper gel sat above the slit, and the periscope showed a clean apron with no new scuffs. A thin scrape came from the latch side, metal on metal in a slow arc, and the hinge did not carry weight, which meant someone worked the edge, not the door. Tessa said, do not open, and she set a 2-minute timer. Mira logged sound and time. Jonah checked panel power. Through the slit, the left shoulder showed a fresh shine near last week's pry mark. A mirror on a stick showed a string across the channel, low near the drain, a trick to catch feet or to measure step length. I said, run the decoys, and Jonah slid 2 boxes toward the culvert and sound moved away from the door. The scrape stopped, the beam went dark. 50 seconds later, a pebble clicked on the right shoulder and rolled into the drain. The beam lit again and held. Tessa said, he wants us to open for the wrong side, and the slit stayed left. The bar stayed seated while my palm read tremor, the wheel stayed cold, and no breath came through the seam. Whoever was out there worked slow. A tap sounded on the face, then another under it, small and spaced, and the beam flickered with each touch, which meant a body near the mat but not centered. I said, say where you are standing, and a voice answered from low and right. The person said, I am alone and need water. Tessa said, a count of 1 does not rest against steel. I added, step center apron so we can see hands. The voice said, bad knee, and the beam stayed red. The mirror showed a dark edge held flat to the latch. A sharp smell carried through the slit, more like solvent than fuel, and I said, glue, because gumming a latch traps a wheel and buys time for a rush. We moved to the non-lethal plan. Tessa said, On my count, then raised the gel, Jonah lifted the shield. Mira called seconds. At 0, the wheel cracked a finger. Tessa sent a short burst through the ceiling slit at the latch edge. Jonah hit the strobe once at the bend. A shout came low on the right. The beam dropped, stone scraped. The mirror showed a hand pull back from the latch with a string on the wrist. The wheel closed, the bar seated. The decoy sound moved deeper into the culvert. The beam blinked once and went dark. Tessa said, "Read the face," and the slit showed a gray smear across the latch plate and a thin wedge set near the lower pin, almost flush in painted frame color. We do not pull planted wedges from outside. Hands near a seam invite grabs. The fix is inside. The bar pocket seated clean. The hinge felt free. The wheel turned a quarter and back without bite. Mira said, "String still by the drain." I said, "Cut it from inside." Jonah slid a hooked blade through the slit and lifted, line loose and gone. 4 minutes passed. The beam stayed dark. The rod went out and across the face and came back with a thin, clear smear. I said, "Sand and paint the latch before dusk," and Mira wrote it. Jonah cut a small steel shoe for the left shoulder and tapped it into place. Silas answered on the half-hour, said, "Pioneers, gum doors, and mark drains, then come back with 2 trucks. Tessa said, "Watch the service road." Mira drew a line from the quarry. We logged plain words and closed the box. The tally read, "Water steady, air good, quiet medium, trust 4 plus Silas with a note. Latch gummed and wedge at lower pin." Coda lifted his head and stared at the seam again. The beam lit and held. A heavier shape pressed the hinge and heat rose under my palm. Dusk settled flat over the ridge and a cool wind ran down the drainage, and we used that wind because it carried noise away from the door and kept our scent tucked against rock. The hollows like sound and shine. They chase rattles and heater warmth, and they learn doors by counting the seconds between a click and a bolt. We planned to sweep with us behind steel. 2 decoy boxes would hum near the culvert, trip bells would stay armed on the channel edges, and the low strobe at the bend would pop only if bodies crowded the corner. I checked the bow because it stays quiet and the shaft will not return off stone into our own door, and I wrapped the grip with cloth so it would not squeak in my hand. Tessa covered pots and cut the flame early. Mira taped the tiny LEDs on the radio so nothing bled light through the slit, and Jonah timed the decoys so one would start and the other would follow. Silas said, "Traffic up valley, not trucks, more like a group that stops and starts," and he asked us to keep noise low until full dark. I said, "Copy," and set rain to low so we could hear gravel shift and still hide our breath. And I told the kids that one person talks at a time and only when the board says move. Coda pointed his nose at the right shoulder and held it. The ribbon at the ridge twitched twice and stopped. Both signs meant watch right and do not chase left. The first box started with a soft hum. The second joined 10 seconds later, and the sound walked down the culvert like a small motor, and that was enough to pull any curious heads away from the face. The beam blinked and held, then dropped, then held again. A stagger that fits a change of direction, not a straight walk. I put an eye to the slit and saw rake lines and gray dirt, and I kept my mouth shut because words carry through seams better than radios do. Mira said, "Ribbon still?" Jonah said, "Box too good." Tessa kept count on her fingers so we could read timing in one place. A tin rolled into the apron from the left, hit a rake line, and stopped near the drain. Somebody was testing bounce and sound. Name said, "Strobe ready." I nodded and kept the bow low. Another tin rolled from the right, stopped short of the first tin, then small stones tapped the face one by one. The panel threw a steady red, so I raised the bow, rested the tip on the slit edge, and set my palm lightly on steel so I would not crowd the gap. A shape moved low at the right shoulder, more crawl than walk, and Coda's ears flattened, and the ribbon twitched once more. I said, "One at right shoulder, low." Tessa said, "Beanbag on call." Jonah shifted one step and kept the muzzle down. The head lifted and caught the last light. The skin looked dry and gray. The eyes tracked the tins, then the slit like a glint marked our side. I waited for Center Apron because Center is clean for us and bad for them, and patience saves more skin than courage at a door. The figure shook the first tin, paused, then set it back and looked for the second, and that small order told me this one hunted by habit, not rush. I held breath and set the shaft, and when the hand lifted toward the seam, I let the string go. The shot landed near the wrist, the figure pulled back and hissed, and the beam blinked twice and held. Tessa said second set, and the decoys rose in a quick stagger. The hums moved toward the ravine, and the figure followed them as if a line tugged from its chest. 2 more bodies crawled from the left shoulder, hands flat and heads low, and they froze when the tins rattled again. Jonah said, "Count 3, Mira wrote. I watched the left because right was moving away and left still held ground. One of the new bodies pressed an ear to the rake lines like it could hear footfalls in dirt, then lifted and sniffed the seam, and the beam held steady for 3 long breaths. I said, "Gel if it rises." Tessa said, "On your mark." Jonah said, "Strobe on the bend if hands show on paint." We waited. The mouth touched steel and the lashes fluttered at the strobe hood. I kept the bow still and let the decoys do the pull. Then the sound stepped once and drifted down slope. Rain reached the stone shoulders and the hollows stirred, so we switched to wet rules because noise changes when water runs over grit. Towels sat at the threshold, mats got checked for slip, and gear dried before the bend while the strobe stayed low. Silas said, "Traffic paused at the quarry and lights drifted without shutting down, and I logged it and set the vent to medium so steam would not bleed." Tessa kept a stew, barely moving. Mira taped the scope sleeve, and Coda held the seam while the panel stayed dark and the ribbon stuck north. We used the lull to clear the backflow flap and wipe the screen. I set the hook, Tessa braced the shield, and Jonah worked screws while Mira watched. The flap swung free and seated tight. The hook dragged leaf mesh, and we marked screws with paint so drift would show later. The panel threw red while the last screw turned, and the hinge took centered weight, so I braced behind the bar pocket and kept my palm flat on steel. Tessa said, "Hold." Jonah said, "Beanbag ready." Mira said, "Count," and the beam held red. I said, "Why are you at our door?" And a woman answered from Center Apron. She said, "Out of food, chased by a sun flag, need safe tonight." We do not open for stories. We open for distance and clean checks, so I said, "Step back 5 yards and show hands," and the pressure light flickered, then held. She said, "Please." A tight cough followed from her left. Tessa said, "Ask count and fever." I said, "How many and any fever?" And she said, 5, none. The beam dropped and lit again like a foot testing the mat, and the hinge carried a near touch that refused to lean. I said, "Center Apron or we end the talk." She said, "Understood," and the beam went dark. Rain thickened and the culvert roared, and Silas said, "Group left the quarry and turned east," so I asked him to avoid our lane. The panel blinked red and held. Coda's ears flattened, and the hinge took knee-high spring weight. I said, "Strobe on my call." Tessa set a hand. Jonah lifted the shield. Mira wrote, and then I said, "Step back now." A hand smacked low and hard, and a second hit followed fast while the bar jumped. We kept the slit clear while the strobe popped and pepper gel crossed the bend. A shape scraped back and the beam dropped. Then another body slapped the seam and the pressure light returned red. I said, "Beanbag," and Jonah fired through the slit. The thump echoed and a tin rolled into the apron. Hollows pulled toward the door while someone else walked the edge and watched timing. Silas said, "Voices on the road," and I said, "Decoys right." And Jonah slid a box and sent a hum toward the ravine, then ran the second with a 10-second gap. The beam burned red and held. The hinge took weight, and a face rose blank and pressed its mouth to the seam. I set an arrow, waited for Center Apron, released, and the figure dropped on tins. The road voices went quiet. Lightning hit close and a white flash wiped the slit clean. My right ear rang and steadied, then a branch knocked into the channel and jammed. The branch hit the mat. The light went red and 3 bodies slammed the door, 2 low and 1 high. The bar held and the wheel groaned. Tessa said, "Gel again." Jonah said, "Strobe now." Mira said, "Count." I said, "Hold, push," and we hit the plan. Gel through the ceiling slit, 1 strobe, shield to the bend. The press eased and a scream trailed right. The hinge went lighter and a boom rolled the drainage. A slap hit my right ear and balance went thin but stance stayed. Tessa said, "You good?" I said, "Right ear half holding." Jonah said, "Light is dark." Mira said, "Wait," stopped, and we kept the door shut a minute and watched the panel. We cleared the branch with the hook and saw 3 shapes slog toward the ravine hum. Then reset the panel and logged the loss. Right ear damage during the blast event. Command stay until it settles and the tally read. Water steady, air good, quiet medium, trust unchanged. Rain-covered steps and the beam stayed dark, but we held. Morning stayed gray and we treated the next knock as a pioneer probe because gum on the latch and string by the drain are their habits. Tally. Water steady, air good, quiet medium, trust 4 plus Silas. We prepped the door the usual way. Tessa packed a field roll. Mira taped the periscope sleeve, Jonah checked the strobe, and I greased hinge pins, chalked the bar pocket, and raked the apron to clean lines. Silas called. 2 trucks with a painted sun, 3 riders, 1 flagman, range 20. I said, "Stay hidden and log." He said, "Copy." Engines idled, boots hit the shoulder, and the beam held red. My palm met the plate, lightweight pressed center. Pike said, "We manage this road, we ask a water tithe and a list of your safe contacts, and we keep your lane clear." Tessa said, "Your tax does not apply here." I said, "Step back 5 yards and stand center." Pike said, "Pay and share and we post a watch on the ridge." I said, "We do not pay water and we do not share names, we keep our own watch." He said, "We can close your lane if we need to," and a rider edged a boot toward the mat and the beam flickered. Tessa said, "Back to the chalk." I said, "Our door does not open to threats." Pike tried softer. He said, "1 week of water and a crate of food for a neighbor fee. Point us to families with fuel problems." I said, "Clean trade only. We can charge a battery pack and give 2 jugs, and we want medical pads and clean gloves." He said, "Too light, we want contacts to route aid." I said, "No list, no names, no door." A rider shook a tin. I said, "Cans are for hollows, not for talks." He leaned on fear. Pike said, "A coughing group moved up valley and 3 houses fell." I said, "We do not open for rumors or fear." He changed tone. Pike said, "We have a nurse." Tessa said, "A nurse is welcome if rules hold and no one carries a list." I said, "Today's offer is a pack charge and 2 jugs, no entry, and you return tomorrow without list or mat games." Pike said, "Not enough." He exhaled. Pike said, "We take the charge and talk tomorrow." I said, "No return unless you drop the tithe and the list." He signaled. A rider brought a pack. I cracked the wheel a hand, slid a cable to the port, and set the charge with the bar seated. While the pack took current, he tried again. Pike said, "Give creek names and we guarantee your lane." I said, "Leave the creek and leave our lane." The meter hit half. I pulled the cable, shut the port, and Jonah rolled 2 jugs on the rod and set them at the chalk. I shut the wheel. They took the pack and water and left. Silas said, "They break east slow." I said, "Copy." We logged. Pioneer contact, charge, and 2 jugs given, tithe and list refused, no entry. Water down 2 jugs, air unchanged, quiet good, trust 4 plus Silas with a down arrow. Silas added, "Pike's crew took a farm well cap and left it dirty." I marked a second down arrow. We set 1 hour of quiet tasks. Halfway through, the panel flashed red and the radio ticked twice without a voice. Door routine again. Rain to medium. Mira on the slit, Jonah by the panel. Tessa leaned on the shield, my palm on the plate. The beam held red and lightweight leaned on the hinge. A girl spoke from center apron and kept distance. She said, "They took our well and my mother is hurt." Tessa said, "Count and signs." The girl said, 2, bleeding, no fever. I said, "Masks first," and stepped to the chalk. Masks went out and came back on faces. The beam stayed dark. I cracked the wheel a finger and slid gauze and tape to the niche. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Sit under the ledge past the creek bend and we bring water in a jug." We do not open for new faces while pioneers orbit. Distance keeps them from marking timing. The wheel shut, the bar seated. The beam blinked red and held too long to be a child. Pike spoke from the right shoulder. He said, "Your answer is reckless. Give us the creek names and we balance books." I said, "Leave the creek and leave the lane." He said, "Last chance." Jonah whispered, "Decoys primed." Tessa whispered, "Gel ready." Mira said, "Wind north." I said, "Back to the chalk or we end the talk." The beam stayed red. We ended the talk. We needed Pike off the lane long enough to fix the latch and seat a shoe, so we built a misdirection we called false light. The goal was simple: make a beacon pattern away from our draw, let his scouts follow it, and keep our door quiet while we worked. Silas said, "I can carry the tones from the far switchback," and I said, "Do it only if you stay off the road and keep the truck dark," and he answered, "Copy with a time." Tessa checked gel and strobe. Mira packed 2 decoy boxes and tape. Jonah grabbed bike reflectors, and I took a small battery and a toggle so we could blink a light without clicks. The hill gives one good line east toward a dry cut that hides a panel if you lean it right, so we taped a narrow mirror to a stake and aimed it to catch a slow sweep from a headlamp and throw a pulse. A hooded LED on the battery gave the same pulse on command. Signals stayed simple: 3 low tones, a pause, then 2 more with a white blink on the third. Silas would send the tones at the minute. Our light would blink, and anyone on the road would read corridor. Jonah said, "What if they split?" And I said, "Then one group chases the cut while the other finds empty gravel, and either way we finish the repair." He tightened tape so the box would not buzz. Mira read wind north and steady, which keeps our smell on rock and carries their noise down to us. Tessa set rain to medium and checked my right ear. I said, "Half and steady," and she said, "Good." We set the mirror near the dry cut, laid 1 decoy in the culvert to walk sound downslope, and hid the second near the switchback toward the quarry so it would sound like someone moving to town. Silas parked in brush and stretched the antenna so it would not sing. On the minute he sent low, 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 pause, low, low, and the LED blinked on the third beat. Through the periscope I saw a headlamp swing, then steady on the cut, then swing again as if someone pointed. We repeated at 2 minutes and 5. 2 riders rolled east at a crawl and a third stayed back with a hand mic. Pike did not give all his eyes, but enough moved to give us a window. Tessa said 30 minutes is enough, and I said go. She set gel. Jonah held the shield, Mira watched the road, and I cracked the wheel for the smallest gap that would still take a brush. I scrubbed the latch face with grit, wiped painted wax thin, then shut the wheel and let it set. The left shoulder shoe took 2 rap taps and seated flush. The bar never left the pocket because steel in place keeps mistakes small. Silas said, "They're reading rocks in the cut," and I said, "Give 1 more set, then go dark," and he said, "Copy." The tones rolled again, the blink matched, and a rider stepped into the cut with his lamp tight to his vest. We reset traps while the paint cured. Jonah strung trip bells. Mira retaped the scope sleeve. Tessa wiped the niche and set a mask pack on the rod, and I checked hinge heat and panel power. The road radio carried Pike's temper. Pike said, "Quit chasing lights and bring me the list." Pike said, "Then find them." I said, "Decoys off," and Jonah killed both hums. The hills went still. A truck door shut. An engine turned. Silas said, "They're turning toward the quarry." I said, "Sit low and wait 5. He said, "Copy." We held position and did not move a shoe. When the timer hit 5, Tessa said, "Check," and I eased the wheel a finger, found no drag, and closed. The paint looked clean through the slit, the shoe sat right, and the mirror lay flat. We pulled the battery and carried the kit home the same way we took it out. Tally. Water steady, air good, quiet high, trust stable. I wrote, latch fixed, shoe seated, false light retired. Then I set my palm on steel and felt a vibration on the hinge that did not match a truck or wind. It rolled close and the beam threw red and held now. The hinge vibration became a steady rumble. The lights dipped twice and we switched from door rules to air rules because power drift can turn a safe room into a bad room. Jonah read the meter and called a climb. Tessa said masks ready. Mira said vents first. I said hold the door and fix flow. We split jobs. Tessa took the utility wall and a spare filter. Jonah took the screen hook and screws. Mira watched the panel and rode, and I stayed at the bar. Silas called and said, "Storm south and sparks at the quarry." I said, "Copy and stay clear." The meter hit a line we do not like, so Tessa raised the fan one step and opened a slow bleed. A knock came through steel like a tool under the seam, and the beam did not light. I said, "Bar stays and wheel stays," and moved to the utility wall. We cut fan power, unlatched the backflow flap, and found wet grit at the elbow. Jonah pulled the screen. Tessa held the light, and I dragged a clump of leaves and mud. The flap swung free, the fan came back stronger, and the meter dipped. 3 pulls hit the rope outside the bend. Mira said, "Danger code." Tessa said, "Decon ready," and set the pole, masks, wipes, and a small kit. Silas said, "Ari is with me and close to delivering." The switchback washed. I said, "We open only if the panel stays dark and flow holds." He said, "Understood." We used the smallest open we keep. The wheel cracked a finger, the bar stayed seated, and the niche took 2 if they stayed still. Ari stood center apron with knees bent. Silas held her elbow, neither touched the seam. Tessa said, "Masks first, then step to the chalk." Both followed. The beam stayed dark. The meter sat high but steady. Wipes and cloth went out and came back. The fan tone shifted and the number ticked up again. Tessa said, "Filter now." Jonah grabbed the spare. I killed the fan. He swapped the frame, and the old filter came out brown and wet. The number dropped. Ari said, "Pressure low and back heavy." Tessa said, "How many weeks?" Ari said, 38. Silas said, 6 minutes and getting shorter. We do not open for care unless we can breathe. The curve moved down and the road stayed quiet. I said, 2 into the niche and no farther. The wheel opened a hand, the shield angled, and Ari stepped in with Silas last. Tessa said, "Sit and breathe through your nose and hold when it tightens." Tessa took a short history. Allergies, blood type, fever, fluid color, last meal. Ari answered, "Steady." Silas said, "A small bag on the rod." I said, "Leave it." Tessa said, "Heat pads and clean scissors." Jonah handed both. She said, "Count with me on the next one," and Ari did. The rumble moved past. The beam blinked once and went dark. I stayed at the slit with the bow ready. Tessa said, "Contraction," and Ari breathed and nodded. Silas said, "I can hold her other hand," and Tessa said, "Do that and keep your feet on the tape." The meter read safe now. Tessa checked the baby with the ear horn and said, "Heart steady." A faint scrape came from the left shoulder. The beam stayed dark. I said, "Motion left." Mira said, "One shape low, then gone." We held. Tessa said, "Next one," and Ari bore down. Rain hit the hill and hid small sounds. The baby crowned. Tessa said, "Hold and breathe, and then push on my word." Ari did, and the baby came. Clear, pat, wrap, and keep the cord loose. The cry came strong, and all eyes fell to the meter. It moved and stayed safe. Tessa said, "Girl," and placed her under the blanket. The beam lit and held. I set my palm on steel and felt weight. Jonah said, "Strobe on call." Tessa said, "Keep calm and no fast moves." Ari held the baby and stayed on the tape. I said, "Center apron and state purpose." A voice said, "Shelter from flood," and the words came from the right shoulder where nobody should stand. The beam flickered like boots on the mat. Tessa said, "Do not open." I said, "Agreed." The bar stayed, the wheel stayed shut. The rumble returned closer, and then a new sound came through steel, deep and steady, and not from a person. Water moved in the culvert. The drain gurgled. The beam went dark. A thin shine showed under the plate at the chipped corner. I said, "Leak at the face." Tessa said, "Sand tubes now." Jonah grabbed 2. Mira held the light. I eased the wheel a finger and wedged the first tube against the leak. The rumble grew. Tessa said, "Keep Ari warm and keep the baby wrapped." Silas said, "Copy." The leak slowed, then stopped, and the drain caught up. We wiped the niche, checked Ari again, and Tessa said, "Stable." I set my hand on steel and watched the panel. It stayed dark for a full minute. The rope held still. The ribbon pointed north. Then the beam lit red and held hard, and a solid hit shook the door like a stump driven by a truck. The hit on the door faded and the beam went dark, so we shifted to vent defense because the vent is the weak point that does not face the bar, and we kept voices low to hear metal from stone. Tessa checked Ari and the baby and moved them back from the niche. Silas watched the meter. Mira slid the scope to the grill. Jonah brought the hook and net and set the shield on edge inside the dogleg. The shaft gives 3 stops from our side, a screen at the mouth that hums when it shakes, a grill a yard in that holds weight, and a baffle past the bend that forces bad angles. Air stayed on medium for Ari because medium hides breath and still lets us catch a scrape. A light pass hit the screen, then a longer saw noise. Jonah said, "Net ready." Tessa said, "No gel into the shaft, let them hang." I said, "Agreed." My palm stayed on steel to confirm the door was not the real attack. A second tool cut the mesh. Jonah set the net hook, took slack, and waited. The last coils let go and the screen dropped. A hand probed the grill. A second fed a thin strip as if a latch lived there. Jonah flicked the net. The line cinched, hands jerked. A body cursed and pulled back. We held the line and let the angle do work. A second body shoved a stick through to pry. I raised a hand. Jonah fired 1.22. Wood snapped. The second body slid away. Smoke came next. Someone stuffed cloth into the mouth and sparked it. Tessa said, "Fan high will push scent out." I said, "Keep medium and bleed the culvert." Jonah pulled the floor drain cover and set the portable to draw down. The meter held steady. Mira said 3 at the mouth and 1 with a hook. The hook scraped the baffle and found the latch hole. I closed it. The hook slipped. I said, "Short gel pulse at the top seam." Tessa sent 1 burst from the ceiling slit. Coughs came back and shoes scraped away. The rope alarm jumped twice. Coda faced the seam. The beam lit red and held. I felt weight, then a second weight, then a third, hits high and low in time. The bar carried them into both jams. Silas said, "Vent quiet, door now." Jonah said, "Strobe on bend." We do not open into a timed hit. We blind, shift weight, and wait for the count to break. The strobe popped once. Feet stumbled. A shoulder hit the left stone and left a streak. The beam dropped and then lit again. Heat climbed into the hinge. We held a minute. When the weight eased, I checked the grill and the baffle. Both held. The vent opening stayed exposed, so I rehung a spare screen with 2 screws and left the third for speed. Mira fed screws so metal would not click. Then the beam lit red harder than before, and my palm felt a slow push that did not match boots or a shoulder. From the mouth, a low scrape began, and the grill answered in ticks. We shifted positions. Jonah held the line with the hook ready. Mira spotted through the scope. I set the lever rifle at the dogleg in case a rush came. The scrape walked the slats toward the stronger right frame. I tapped left so the next bite would waste strength. The bite stalled. The hook slid under the baffle and tried to lift. I dropped the plate hard. Steel rang. The hook skipped. Jonah snapped the net and caught cloth. A body tumbled downslope. Rain softened and then grew. The culvert spoke louder. The beam stayed red, but the weight became pulses, not a lean. Silas said, "Truck on the road and voices counting." I said, "Decoy 1 to Ravine and cut after 30. Jonah ran the box and a hum walked right. 1 weight left the plate and the beam wavered. I eased the wheel 1 finger to feel drag, found none, closed again, and set my palm back on steel. No fresh pry mark showed. We firmed the grill with a wedge and a wooden shim. A clatter came as a tool fell, then steps retreating. The beam went dark. The scrape stopped. Silas whispered, "Meter steady and air clean," and Tessa nodded once and kept Ari calm with a hand on her shoulder. I started to call the tally. The rope alarm twitched, not a pull but a brush. Coda lifted his head. The beam lit red in a sharp snap, the kind that comes from a foot on the mat and a hand reaching for the seam at the same time. I said, "Hold fast," then set the lever rifle to the slit without showing the muzzle. Tessa raised the shield. Jonah squared to the bend. Mira counted. The next hit landed on the hinge line, and the bar jumped in the pocket hard. Pike wanted a list and a water tithe, the Hollows wanted heat, and both had learned our timings, so we changed the rules and wrote a short plan called Blue Line. Finish the latch fix, clear the vent mouth, run decoys to the ravine, and hold the door until trucks left the service road. Tessa set Ari and the baby deeper with Mira. Silas took the meter and rope to call danger without moving, and Jonah laid Caltrops in the channel 5 feet off the face with a clear center path that only we knew. I rubbed the latch plate, waxed the face, checked for chips, felt cool hinge pins, and set the bar so it took weight without a click. Tessa set rain to low, and Jonah warmed a decoy and timed the second to lag by 10. Blue Line kept talk short. 1 stop, 2 move, 3 back, and now meant gel, then strobe. No names at the seam. If Pike tried to talk us into a mistake, the shield answered. The panel lit red, Coda's ears pinned. Weight pressed center, backed off, then returned with a twist that said a hand felt for the seam. Tessa said, hold. Jonah said, decoys ready. Silas said, radio quiet. I said, wait for center apron. Pike spoke from the right shoulder. Pike said, last chance to make this easy, give the creek families and pay a week of water. Tessa said, center or it ends. He kept running his line. The beam blinked as a boot crossed near the seam, and I said, center apron or the talk stops. Jonah started the first box, and a low hum walked down the ravine. Then the second joined to sell the sound of feet moving away. 2 bodies shifted off the face, the beam faded, then returned as new weight pressed low. A small hand tapped paint twice and slid down, a trick that throws sympathy while a pick moves, so I kept my palm hard on the bar while Tessa raised the shield. The beam dropped. A tin rattled, then Caltrops rang. A boot yelped, the panel held red. I said, now. Tessa sent pepper gel across the bend while Jonah flashed the strobe and drove the shield into the dogleg. A body slipped on the right strip and went down. Another tripped the left, and the clear center stripe made them pause. Pike said, take the seam. 3 hits came high, low, and middle. The bar jumped but stayed, and Tessa held ground. I said decoys off, and Jonah killed both hums so sound would not pull friends toward the door. Mira counted 9 hits, the rhythm broke, boots scuffed back, and the beam fell dark. We opened the wheel, a finger for glue, found none, shut it, then felt a pry stop on the waxed face. Silas said, hollows on the road edge. The screen twanged, the grill ticked, and the baffle rang, so Jonah snapped the net and caught a wrist. A short yelp came, and the weight on the door eased as 2 pulled the net and lost balance on Caltrops. We held without hauling so they would retreat. Pike tried charm again. Pike said, we keep walkers off your ridge if you share water and names. I said, we keep our own ridge and names. He said, then you buy trouble. I said, your trouble stops at the chalk. The idle truck revved. A rope swung in the cut. A hook scraped at the latch. I dropped the baffle and the hook bounced. Jonah fired 1.22 and it skipped into gravel, and the truck eased forward like it meant to shove. The plate did not bow. I said, now, and Tessa flashed once, peppered the bend, and raised the shield while Mira pulled the rope alarm 3 short. Boots slid on the strips, someone cried, and 2 more tripped. The idle truck shut off, the creeping truck backed up, the beam went dark, and the culvert roared. We waited 30. Silas said, engines east. I said, confirm. He said, confirmed, tail lights at the quarry turn. Coda's ears eased. I lifted my palm and felt no weight. We held a minute more. Tessa said, reset strips and wipe gel. Jonah lifted Caltrops with a magnet rake and bagged them. I rechecked the latch and hinge. Mira logged times, and Silas touched the meter and exhaled. Blue Line ended with a still door and a clear channel. We put gear on hooks, washed the niche, and set a pot to warm for Ari. The tally read, water steady, air good, quiet high, trust 5 with Silas and Ari. I set my palm on steel, and the panel stayed dark quietly. We kept the door, and the hill stayed quiet through morning light, and the meter held where we wanted. The vent ran clean on medium, the latch paint cured, and the left shoulder shoe sat flush. Tessa cleaned the niche and checked Ari and the baby again, then wrote stable on the board. Silas tightened the new screen and wrapped the mouth. Jonah oiled the bar pocket and chalked the hinge. Mira logged times and wind. I stood by the plate and let my right ear settle. The ring came and went, but balance felt fine. We ate quietly and changed shifts without talk because quiet keeps habits strong after a long night. Silas said, I will stay on the ridge and walk the road cut after the water drops. Ari said, we can work for food, and Tessa said, work is fine when it pays in quiet and order. We wrote the house rules again so the new hands could see them and so the kids could read them out loud. 1 door, short talk, clean air, and no lists for strangers. I added, no returns for taxes, and Tessa nodded. Jonah asked if the Caltrops could stay in the channel. I said, not today. We only set them when trucks idle near the shoulder, and he bagged them. Mira asked if the Decoys could hum for training. Tessa said later, after rest. Silas checked the radio at the hour and heard no pioneers on the band, only a far voice counting slow weather. We left it alone. Coda slept by the seam and did not twitch. I opened the box and wrote the final line for the night. Water steady with 2 jugs down and the spring map paid back. Air good with a fresh filter and a clean flap. Quiet high with the Decoys cold and the Strobe capped. Trust 5 with Silas and Ari on board and no neighbors owed. Mira drew the date under the tally. Silas signed the board. Tessa said door, and I set my palm on steel and felt nothing but our own weight in the plate. Silas said ridge clear. Mira said ribbon north. Jonah said panel dark. Ari said thank you. We stacked bowls, wiped the floor, and set the timer for the watch. Tessa took first shift with me, and we stood by the bar and watched the hinge. I said, we keep the door, we keep the rules, and we keep each other, and Tessa said lock it, and I slid the bar into the pocket and watched the pin seat, and the hill stayed quiet and the mountain was ours. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I'm Jace Harlow, and this was our 30 days under the hill, 1 door, 1 plan, and a family that kept the line. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.